Thank you for coming. Today we are in conversation with Sean Binder, this is Sean Binder, and discussing the Free Humanitarians Campaign and how to support a group of people facing criminalisation for doing search and rescue in Lesbos. I think if we start off with, if you want to tell me and us all a little bit about the case, what brought you to Lesbos. Actually, if we do like pre-case, if we do just what brought you to Lesbos, what was your life like beforehand, and who you are as a person.
Sure.
Then we'll do that.
Sure. I mean, it's not particularly interesting, to be honest with you. I grew up in Ireland. I'm German Vietnamese originally. My mother is German. My father is Vietnamese. But my mother moved to Ireland in 1999 when I was 4 years old, and I fell in love with the ocean, as most would on the southern coast of Ireland. It's absolutely stunning. And I did a lot of surfing and sailing, and I did some scuba diving. When I was 16, I worked for a scuba diving centre, and they wouldn't pay me anything, but they said they would train me up to rescue diver level. So I had some skills, and so when I went to university and I studied, and I specialised, I went to university, I did a master's here in London, and I specialised in European defence and security policy. But it's when I realised that the way that the European Union responds to one of the most severe humanitarian crises since arguably the Second World War is by securing our border against people in distress. I felt that I had some skills and I had some knowledge, and so I could go volunteer on Lesbos for, I initially thought maybe 3 months, but as these things always happen, 3 months turned into a few more months, and then I was there for just shy of a year volunteering, basically.
And what made you kind of think to go to Lesbos?
Again, there were, as I was studying, just the so-called migrant crisis was unraveling, and the situation got more and more dire, and in the ideal world there would be no need for civilian search and rescue. It shouldn't have to happen. In a better world there would be search and rescue, but it would be done by the authorities, by the Greek authorities, or by the European Union, or by Italy. But what we saw is that it was happening less and less. There were fewer and fewer search and rescue boats going out from the authorities, and more and more bricks being put into Fortress Europe. And this made a gap where there were people drowning more or less needlessly, and I felt that I was probably quite naive at the time, but I thought maybe I could do something to help, and so that's what I tried to do. It wasn't particularly special, I just thought I could give a few months of my time.
And what was Lesbos like when you got there? Like, who were the type of people who were volunteering? Who were the type of people who you met while doing search and rescue? Did you get to know much about their experiences kind of outside of when you met them
Sure.
in the process?
I think it's worth noting that I joined a Greek organization quite purposefully. I felt that joining a Greek organization would be important because by the time I got there, 2017, it had been almost 3 years of the so-called migrant crisis. And many people at the time, especially the lesbian community, they felt like they were losing agency and they were becoming quite powerless in this environment where there were so many international organizations and there was so much pressure that we saw this change in attitude. So at the beginning of the crisis, Lesbos was rightfully applauded for its showing of solidarity to the asylum seekers who were in distress. Fast forward 2 years, when there was so little help being offered by Athens, and Athens was really receiving so little help from the European Union, those attitudes hardened quite a lot. So I had come to the island in quite a tense time, and so I felt that as a non-Greek person, that I should at the very least be part of a Greek effort. And that's why I joined ERCI, which was a Greek organization. The others who joined me were equally motivated, I think, to be part of search and rescue, all of them appreciated that people shouldn't be drowning. I think when you strip away the ridiculous charges that I face, which we'll get to, and when you strip away the political context, what the core question is here, should people be abandoned to drown? And of course, no one should be abandoned to drown. And so that was like more or less the common feeling that all of us shared who joined the organization, and that's what we were motivated by.
And who did you meet on the shores? Who did you meet in terms of who you were search and rescuing? Were there people from one particular background or conflict? Was it a mixture? How did they find Lesbos? That kind of thing.
So like on a practical background level, most people at the time came from Syria or Afghanistan. Of course, Syria was and still is in conflict. Afghanistan, although designated a safe third country, is incredibly dangerous, and more so now than it was in the past. But even at the time, on almost every measurement, Afghanistan had become less safe and less safe, less whole, less supported than it was in the decades prior. Whether it's women's access to education, whether it's the opium growth, whether it's bombings, whatever it might be. And so it's very understandable people would try to leave. But it also meant that people were very diverse. I mean, there were people who were running away with their families, with everything that they possibly owned on their backs, and then there were folks who, just single young men who were coming, and sometimes just unaccompanied minors. It really varied. What is definitely true, though, is that all of them were running from danger and from fear of persecution, of violence, and all of them at least deserved to be able to apply for asylum and therefore should not have been left out at sea or pushed back to Turkey. On a more personal level, I think people often tell me, and I hear this a lot, unfortunately, people writing to me on social media saying things like, these are all terrorists, these are all undeserving people, these are all economic migrants who are going to steal my job, as though an economic migrant for some reason deserves to drown. I think the main thing is that it doesn't matter who you are. I've met folks at the shoreline or in boats who I could see myself being friends with. I've met folks who I'm sure I would never be friends with because we completely disagree on our worldviews, and they have views that I oftentimes find abhorrent. But that does not mean that they deserve to drown. And that's, I think, the core point here, is that it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, what your background is, what the things that you've done in the past, things you might do in the future, you don't deserve to drown. You deserve to be helped, and you deserve to seek asylum. And whether or not you eventually get international protection is not in my control. And it's not something that I necessarily have views on. So I think, to answer your question quite short, all kinds of people arrive on the shoreline because all kinds of people are affected by conflict, and all kinds of people deserve help.
Absolutely. And so then, shall we move a little bit into how you're in this position now? So you were volunteering, doing search and rescue in Lesbos, and now you're facing potentially 25 years in prison. What was the job? What was the journey from there to there?
Yeah, so ironically, I joined an organization, ERCI, that had a very strong relationship with the authorities. I recall it standing shoulder to shoulder with the police officers that arrested us. I recall distinctly one night, it was pouring rain, it was a lightning storm. There were like 4 boat arrivals, like 200 people had come. There was quite a few issues that we needed to take care of, like emergency medical issues. And then the Coast Guard were just asleep in their jeeps while this was happening the entire night through. So we had definitely worked with the authorities, and we tried to complement their services as much as we could, for better or worse. And despite that, in February of 2018, I was arrested. I was arrested one night. It's like 2 a.m. or something. And we were, if you can imagine, this is the island of Lesbos, and this is the Turkish shoreline here. It's only a couple of miles across. We were at this very southern shore. It's worth pointing out that Lesbos is really small. But of the 2,200,000 people that sought asylum in Europe, about half of them went through Greece, and half of those went through this part of the island. So it's an incredibly busy couple of miles here. And we were at this last point because at night this becomes incredibly dangerous. It's cliff face, and that's why we're here. And so around 2 a.m. we were parked up here, as we were every single night for 2 years, and the police suddenly arrive, just kind of normal, and the police say, "Show us your passports." Gave them our passport. Again, this is pretty normal. And then they asked for more documentation, which we gave them. And then they started walking around the Jeep and started muttering to themselves that there was something suspicious here. We still didn't have any idea what they were referring to. And then they took us in for questioning at the police station.
And who's us in this context?
So Sarah Martini, not exactly Sarah. So Sarah Martini is a colleague of mine. And she's remarkable in her own right, far more remarkable than I am. She fled Syria in 2015. She herself was in Damascus when bombs were falling, and took her sister, who was younger than her, to the exact same route between Turkey and Lesbos. And their boat actually began to sink when she hopped in the water. She's a professional swimmer, and literally dragged the boat to safety, swimming for hours in the water. And when she made it to the shore, she was rightfully praised for her work. And
she was only 15 or so at the time, wasn't
no,
she?
she was 21, 22, I think.
How did I make that
Or
up?
20, I think, at the time.
Okay, but she was still...
Her sister was younger though. That's
Yes.
why, yeah. So Yusra went on, her younger sister went on to swim in the Olympics as part of the refugee team, and was actually in Tokyo. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas Sarah took a very different approach and went back to Lesbos, back to the island to help people taking the same journey that she took. And she and I were in the Jeep together when we were first arrested. So we were taken at 2 a.m. to the police station, and we were spent one night in a cell. The following morning, under armed guard, they took us to the warehouse to look at the various medical supplies that we had. We had a huge warehouse full of medical supplies because we ran a clinic in Moria refugee camp, one of the most infamous refugee camps in Europe. And they found nothing. Then they went to my home. They searched through bags of baking flour to look for drugs. They cast it out very wide. They pulled it back and they found nothing. And yet, we spent another night in jail, and then we gave them our devices and our computer, our phones to investigate. And we were released pending further investigation. About 4 days later, an article was written in a right-wing online publication that said something like this: a German spy, me, and his Syrian accomplice, Sarah, were caught in a stolen Jeep trying to infiltrate a military base to steal state secrets. It was written like this, completely ridiculous. Again, just to recap, we were parked in one place where we'd been for years in a Jeep that was branded in ERCI, the organization's logos. So impossible to suggest that it was trying to infiltrate a military base. We felt at the time that there's no chance that this would ever become an actual prosecution because we did nothing wrong. And helping people should never be criminalized. And so naively we continued working, again, shoulder to shoulder with the authorities. So that was in February. And in August, I actually left for Ireland for a couple of weeks because my grandmother was terminally ill and was passing away, so I went to say goodbye to her. And I came back, and 2 weeks later, we were finally formally arrested. We were arrested for very serious crimes, including being part of a criminal organization, money laundering, fraud, forgery, espionage, and of course smuggling. And these are incredibly serious crimes. We will be sentenced, if found guilty, for centuries into the future. We would face 25 years in prison. And when we were first charged, Sarah was on her way back to Berlin, where she was studying. The police said, "We have a couple of questions for you." She was about to board the plane. The police came in plainclothes, surrounded her and said, "We have a couple more questions for you, Sarah, just a couple more questions, and then you can go back on the next flight, we promise." And Sarah knew for a fact that this wasn't going to be the case. So she went in, and I got a phone call at around 6 a.m. I was preparing to go to the clinic, or 7 a.m. Sarah's been arrested. She's being questioned. They want to see you as well. So I went into the station. We got no information on what was happening. We waited for hours, and of course I had work to do. So eventually, I think we had been there since about 7 a.m. and and it was now maybe 12, and I said, look, if you're not going to do anything, I'm going to go, I need to work. And they said, no, you're under arrest. And at that point, they handcuffed me and Sarah together, and they took us into the courtroom where we were charged with all of these crimes. And at that moment as well, because the charges are so severe, they said, there's a risk that you would recommit. There's a risk that you would commit flight, as in trying to escape from the charges. And for that reason, you're going to be held in pre-trial detention. Which is where we remained for 3.5 months. It's about 106 days we were held in a police cell, and then also in a proper prison. It's interesting because pre-trial detention ostensibly it's supposed to be in keeping with the idea that you're innocent until proven guilty. But in practice, I recall being handcuffed to someone who had committed double homicide. He had burned 2 people alive and murdered them. We were treated the exact same way. We were
And you had been
convicted felon. We were treated the exact same way. And so from my experience, there is no real difference between innocent until proven guilty and being treated as someone who is guilty within the Greek judicial system. That was really quite difficult to grasp at first. And so we waited, and very luckily though, arguably because Sarah and her sister had such a high profile, the organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the media became interested in our case and began to speak about it. And that made it untenable for the authorities to claim that we were a flight risk. And so they had to release us after 3.5 months, because we could have been in there for 18 months, if not longer. And so, although we could have been in there for a very long time, although we were in there for a very long time, 3.5 months, I felt that we were lucky to leave so early. And I can't feel too bitter, because what I learned at the time was that so many asylum seekers are in prison. And at the very least, I'm being charged with something. And that suggests that at least I might be guilty of something. The asylum seekers that I met in prison, they weren't being charged with anything. No one even bothered accusing them of something. They were just in there. And they might still be in there. And so this is it's a much broader problem than just my experience or Sarah's experience. Not only are there 21 other people within my case, so it's Sarah and Nasos and myself and 21 others, but there are at least 180 individuals in 13 European states who've been criminalized like I have. And there are countless numbers of unknown asylum seekers who are in prison right now, who never got a whiff of fair process, who never got their fair trial, who weren't even, more likely than not, even tried. And so this is a wider structural problem of criminalization of solidarity, and indeed criminalizing the asylum process itself. I think that's the real thing here. That's what's so scary about it, is that it could happen to you, it could happen to you, it could happen to any of us. Because all I did was try to help somebody in distress. I mean, what would you do if you saw someone drowning? What would you do? If, like me, you would put an arm out and try to help them, then you've committed the exact same crime that I am supposed to have committed. Doing search and rescue, offering assistance, seeking asylum, these are all enshrined in the law. We have an obligation to search for and to rescue those in distress. You have a fundamental right to seek asylum. You have a fundamental right to life. So when people say, was there any illegality happening? There may well have been, but it isn't search and rescuers who are doing it. It is those people who are building Fortress Europe. It is those people who are externalizing our border and forcing people into smuggled and dangerous journeys that I would argue are culpable for a lot of this.
And so where are we now? Because your trial, we were discussing a little bit before, begins on the 18th of November, so that's in a week and a couple of days.
Yeah, 9 days.
9 days. And what are you on trial for in this trial? Are there going to be other trials?
Right.
How do we expect it to go?
Yeah, so I think, and I was saying this earlier a little bit with regards to innocent until proven guilty. There's an idea, because we're not in pre-trial detention, that now things are fine. and they're not fine, because the limbo is part of the punishment. The moment we were arrested, all the search and rescue organisations on the southern part of the island stopped working. Today, there are no operating search and rescue organisations on Lesbos. And we face trial now, in 9 days' time, for only the misdemeanours. That is, only the smaller crimes. Those are forgery, listening to radio communications, which is no longer actually part of the penal code, and espionage. Believe it or not, espionage is only a misdemeanour.
Sure.
And it's a bit bizarre. James Bond is actually not that cool because it's only misdemeanours. But we expect this to drag on for years and years, and we aren't even talking about the felonies. That is the bigger charges of smuggling, of money laundering, of being part of a criminal organisation. Those could take another 17 years. And when you think about it, not only is that a huge personal cost, because obviously I can't afford a legal team and I can't afford to wait and hold off my life forever as I have been doing until now, but that's 17 years of frightening away bona fide humanitarian activity when it is so necessary, and will be more necessary in the future when, unfortunately, in the absence of structured migration pathways for those in need, irregular migration will become more and more prevalent. And yet we're criminalising and making afraid those who would try to help. So the cost is much bigger than it is for me. And so it is a small trial now, and then eventually a bigger trial, and then the limbo in between.
And should we chat a little bit about their basis for espionage charges? Because I think that's something that is very relatable. Like, some of this, I think, can feel quite separate from people. Like, not everyone can see themselves going to Lesbos, not everyone can see themselves being a search and rescue worker, although I know you rightly point out that it's a very normal thing to do. It's not particularly interesting or unique thing to do. I think some people would potentially see themselves as being a bit separated from this. But what is the basis of the espionage charges?
Yeah, so I think it's worth unpicking. As I said, the trial that we're facing in 9 days' time, the first charge that we face is listening into radio communications illegally. First of all, that is no longer part of the criminal code in Greece. It's ridiculous that we have to face it. It isn't actually legal anymore. Number 2 is espionage, which on the face of it seems so severe and so important. You have this idea that it's state secrets being traded on some shady yacht somewhere in the ocean. This idea of nefarious activity. When you unpack what they actually are charging us with, it is these two things. It is 1, using encrypted communication services. That is, using communications that the authorities cannot listen in on. And number 2, listening in on encrypted communication services or encrypted communications between the authorities. So the first one is, I think, the most strikingly incoherent with logic. That is, they say that we were using encrypted communications. What they're referring to here is WhatsApp, the communication service on my phone. Literally millions, I think billions of people use WhatsApp as a daily communication. My grandmother used it. It is preposterous to suggest that because I use WhatsApp, I must be trying to hide something. It is the most convenient and most prevalent communication service today. Completely ridiculous. Number 2 is that we were listening in on encrypted communications. Now, the police themselves gave our VHF radios. They say that we were using these VHF radios to listen in on these communications. They gave them to the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard took them and then searched them and basically probed them, and they concluded these are off-the-shelf radios that cannot listen to encrypted communications. They're just not able to do so. And in fact, the only reason that anybody can hear the authorities is because they don't have, this is such a weird point, they don't have interoperable encrypted communications systems. That is, that the Coast Guard, the Navy, and the European Border Institution, Frontex, don't have the same hardware. They can't talk to each other. So they speak on public channels. They speak on public channels like Channel 16. I'm not sure if you've ever been on a boat, but you would know that a radio on a boat should be turned on, And it should be scanning public channels because channel 16 in particular is where emergencies are broadcast. Mayday calls are broadcast on channel 16, which is exactly what a search and rescue organization should be listening to. And so if the authorities are saying anything on a public channel, we'll be listening to it. Like any other boat in the entire world, if they're within range of that VHF signal, could hear. And so it's just so groundless, the idea that we were spies. And indeed that is the primary accusation that we face coming to trial. And we can rebut every single charge that we face, every instance of alleged crimes we can, by using the authorities' own evidence, demonstrate that there is nothing to them, that they're empty.
Definitely. And so we've kind of gone through a little bit. How do you expect the case to go? So I know you kind of mentioned that you think it will be dragged on for a long time. How is your legal support? How is the support and everything now? What's it kind of looking like from a legal perspective, but also like a campaigning perspective?
We have been very fortunate to have great lawyers who have been really taken this on board. The fact is that, for better or worse, our case is a test case. It may set precedent about what is considered legal. If we're found guilty, it indicates that if you're a search and rescue organization that happened to use WhatsApp, then you might find yourself in the exact same boat. And let me tell you, that is every single search and rescue organization. Because every search and rescue, or at least somebody in the team, will have used WhatsApp. So this is an important case, and that's why we're so fortunate to have such great lawyers who can support us. But as I've already said, or tried to indicate, there is no evidence of any wrongdoing, and yet we're still waiting. We've waited 3 years. This is dragging on and on and on. And so what we believe is that this will be one with hearts and minds. What's so important in this is raising awareness, is campaigning, is making it very clear to people that this is actually happening, and not just to some very individualized search and rescue organizations, but it can happen to anybody. And that's what's so frightening. That is why campaigning has been so important to us. That's why Jo has been so important to me, because she has facilitated so much campaigning here in the UK. And luckily we've had support from others across Europe and other places further afield to try and raise awareness about this, to contact politicians, as Jo has done, to contact MEPs in Europe, to contact anybody who's willing to listen, to really indicate that this is frightening because it affects all of us.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of
Please,
course.
of
Go
course.
ahead.
Well, it does seem completely outrageous and ridiculous that you're being charged with these heinous crimes. Have you considered that it might be that they might expect you to give them a backhander and then they'd forget about it?
Have you considered paying more?
Bribery. That would be a crime, I suppose.
Yeah, it would be a crime, but that's how things used to work with the sort of minor things years ago in Greece.
You're not the first person to suggest this, and I think it...
It would be a crime, that's definitely a problem.
But you're right in suggesting that. I think the important point here is, how can this happen? If this was all above board, if there was actually wrongdoing, then fair enough that they're pursuing this trial, but there isn't. There doesn't seem to be. Then why is it being pursued? I think there is something more. I don't want to suggest that that the police authorities are just trying to get a backhander here, but when you try to unpick the evidence, for example, they say, in the evidence that they use against me, they go to the cell tower. So my mobile phone data goes to a tower, goes to space, and they can glean all the information from that cell tower that I have made calls or where they've gone to or whatever it might be. So like the satellite in space, that's how these mobile technologies work. They ping back and forth. Anyway, so you can glean all that information from a cell tower on the island. And they've done so. They've taken my phone record from that cell tower and they say, look, on this night we know you were smuggling. We know you were smuggling because at 3 a.m. you placed a call to 112. And the authorities say that I wouldn't have called 112 but for the fact that I was smuggling. and I should have called the authorities, and I didn't do so, and therefore is a crime here. What I had to tell the inquisitor...
You could look at the way what the police are trained to do in terms of targets. Because when I lived there decades ago, there were 2 young policemen who came up to me one.
Sorry?
The retail one?
Oh, no, that's the next door. Yeah.
Which one is one?
There were 2 young policemen who came up to me and required my residence permit, and I said, why do you want that? And they said, oh, we have to ask so many people for their residence permit every week.
Really?
And they must be every week. It was just a silly little regulation.
Just quotas.
It would be worth checking that is not what they're doing.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because there have been verbatim charges pressed against other organisations, so they seemingly just to be going for it without really any substance. Which is quite, as I was indicating earlier, it's quite frightening that that's happening.
Yeah, but if it's just a bureaucracy, it's worth finding that out.
I hope it really isn't that case, and I don't think it is, because there are, I really doubt, and I really hope that isn't the case, that in a European democracy like Greece, that one doesn't end up in prison just for bureaucratic reasons.
Well, I wouldn't bank on it.
You're a wiser investor than I am, apparently.
I love Greek people, but their justice system is not something I would have the utmost faith in on the whole. Well, it used to be. I mean, I haven't been there for years, but seriously, there is an issue there, I think.
Look, I mean, I won't give my personal opinion on the matter. I don't think it would reflect well if the Greek prosecutor watched this later on YouTube. But certainly, the European Court of Human Rights has often criticized Greece for its inadequate care with regard to its judicial system. And so, authorities on the matter far more sage than me have noticed that Greek judicial processes are not ideal and are, well, oftentimes, according to these trials, illegal. And so, you're not the only person to suggest this. European courts also do.
I mean, it shouldn't be. Well, I may be completely barking up the wrong tree, but if there's a possibility, it could be that. It would be worth.
We feel that
checking.
It's probably quite, yes, you're right, and we ought to, and certainly the legal team have been on top of this, and there seems to be a genuine belief that we are maybe not necessarily criminal, but there's a belief that search and rescue enables smuggling, and that's the core issue, I think, and we can get into what that means politically and whether that's true. But I think that's why we see the case. Not because we necessarily did something wrong, but because they want us to stop all the same.
Yeah. And that's actually when you kind of mentioned around this could happen to any person. We were having a conversation planning things a few weeks ago now, and my dad said, make sure you don't get yourself arrested now. And I was like, what are they going to do? I've not even been to Greece, I've not even been to Lesbos. What are they going to do? And then I found out that 21 people are facing charges for having communicated to you via WhatsApp. And I went,
You're in my WhatsApp.
oh, well, I was a little bit too smug about this situation. And so I think it does kind of show some of the randomness of it in terms of how people are related. And I guess on that note, we kind of wanted to relate this to St James's, to this local context, and also to a local context in terms of Britain and Britain's relationship with those going through the asylum system and migrants in general. And I realised I started off this and didn't introduce myself, which is like really arrogant of me, but I realise now that we're recording, so not everyone in the room, or everyone not in the room might not know who I am, and that was very fair. My name's Jo Gowers, and I'm the Refugee and Asylum Support and Advocate here at St James's. So I'm employed by the church to support members of the community, of the congregation who are going through the asylum system and have since got leave to remain status. And I think it's a really, really important, I mean, obviously I'm biased because I think it's an important part of the work we do because it's my job. But I also think it's a really important part of who we are as a church. We are very blessed to have members of the community who come from a range of backgrounds, and also to have, I guess, the trust of people who have systematically and historically been excluded from churches, have been excluded from the Church of England. And that, you know, we know that there aren't a huge range of LGBT plus asylum plus affirming churches. So we know that there's not, if you're queer, if you're LGBTQ plus and you're Christian and you're looking to go to a church, there's not that many options in London or generally. And that's part of the reason why I came to St James's. I looked for affirming churches, and I knew that even though I was a Christian at the time and I'd never really gone to church other than an odd Christmas Eve service and a wedding on my dad's side of the family, I'd never really engaged with church before. But at 17 I was like, oh sure, I'll give it a wee look up, and found St James's. But not only is there a lack of churches where queer people can safely come and know they'll be affirmed, but I think there's also a lack of spaces where if you're a queer asylum seeker, you know that you'll be welcomed, people will understand at least some of the context of what you're going through, and you'll receive support and community. And with some of those tensions between your faith and your identity and your gender, or your gender identity or sexuality, and how that all lives together. And so at St James's we've been doing this work for a good few years now. So I've been doing this post for 2 years. Before that I was doing it as part of the pastoral assistant role, and before that Ruth, my predecessor, was doing it as part of the pastoral assistant role. So we've got members of the community who have been here kind of since 2017, like a really lovely long time. We've got members of the community who I support who are on the PCC, who have preached and done sermons, who read, who are servers, who are, as much as we are continuing to try and open access to different areas of the church, are slowly and surely becoming ingrained in the church and how we operate. And I think there's part of that is obviously related to faith. For us as a church, and so we have seen some of the most brutal aspects of the hostile environment on a day-to-day basis, and obviously I'm not going to go into details because they're not my details or stories to share, but we kind of often describe it as being intentionally, like by design, it is inadequate. By design, it is made to be as hostile, as difficult as possible. And you can clearly see those connections between Fortress Europe and the way that Britain's asylum system works, in terms of the imprisonment of those in the asylum system. We see detention centres here, which is essentially the same thing. People are incarcerated without any crime or any real reason, potentially facing deportation at any minute. That is an indefinite. There is an indefinite amount of time you can be detained for as an asylum seeker in Britain. So people have been there for years, and as we saw with during COVID, the treatment there has been horrendous. The quality, I guess you could say, of where people are being placed has become increasingly worse. So we saw, previous prisons and specific places like Yarlswood turn into barracks, literal military barracks, so like the Napier barracks. And there's another one that are where people are being kept during while they're waiting to be processed, quote unquote. And so I guess I really see some of the real similarities between the context that has allowed for you to be criminalised for the support that you're offering and what's happening here. And when people talk about those providing support to asylum seekers, refugees and migrants as being enabling or profiting people smuggling. I find that to be one of the most frustrating responses, because actually anyone who is engaged with anyone who knows anything about this knows that the thing that profits smuggling the most is a lack of safe legal routes.
Exactly.
There are a real lack of safe routes, and actually we were discussing this the other day with Zonka, who is the CEO of Migrants Organise, and discussing the Amal, Walk with Amal's issue. It was, I think, a 12-foot or something puppet that walked across of a Syrian refugee child who walked from
the border of Turkey.
Yes, the border. Yeah,
to
it was
Manchester.
to Manchester. Yeah, so the border of Turkey to Manchester, and I couldn't remember her starting point there. That's what I was trying to remember. And actually, we were saying some of the narrative that's been missing a bit is, well, why does she have to walk this far? Why can't she get on a plane? Why can't she get on a train from Turkey? Why can't there be safe routes for people to reach here to claim asylum? And that being part of this kind of logic that if enough people don't make it through this journey, if enough people die in the Mediterranean, in the Channel, people will no longer try and make this journey. That's the logic, is that if enough people are trying, and if the message essentially gets back that this journey is too dangerous, people won't try and make that journey. And we know ourselves, anyone who's spoken to people who have been forced to migrate, who are asylum seekers or refugees, knows that that's not going to work. That's not the case, because no matter how dangerous this journey is, we know that if there's even the slightest hope that it could be better than what is facing them at home, that journey is going to be made. People will still risk themselves, their lives, everything they have, because there is still hope for, and rightly so, there's still hope for an alternative, a better life.
And isn't it true as well that the puppet was not allowed into Greece? I believe they weren't allowed to go through Greece.
I don't actually know that.
No, me neither, but that is worth looking up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Too scared by the message of a puppet to actually allow that. But I think in terms of kind of the the landscape here, so we've seen the hostile environment, we've seen the policies that are enacted against migrants and refugees and asylum seekers be that of no recourse to public funds, so not being able to claim any benefits, being given, if you're granted to it, being given what's it called, like allowance basically of less than £40 a week, which, I mean, I don't know about you, but I couldn't live off that. I don't think many people could live off £40 a week, especially when you're not allowed to work. Legally speaking, the majority of those who are still in the asylum process aren't allowed to work. Then also having, either not being allowed to rent or having for those who are given accommodation, the homeless accommodation has been, generally speaking, terrible. There's a tactic of dispersion away from London, away from communities, so people can't kind of organise together. And are generally speaking ripped away from people who they know, are ripped away from communities that people will have built over time. And so I guess, it's so close to us, it's so close to the work that we do, because we know that there's been a lack of routes for the people that we support. We know that the context, the wider context and the policies which are impacting people here are part of the same kind of narrative and rhetoric that are is creating Fortress Europe and the securitization of borders. But also we've seen criminalisation of solidarity and support here. So the Stansted 15, who were a group of activists that tried to stop a deportation flight where there were several very vulnerable people on the flight facing deportation to, I believe, Jamaica. And since then, a number of them have got leave to remain, and a number of them have safely been allowed to stay in the country. But those activists faced terrorism charges, and it was the exact same kind of logic of, if we make this seem so dangerous and so off-putting, people won't provide this support anymore. And like you've said, that's worked in Lesbos, and people aren't, search and rescue organisations aren't able to operate from the ground anymore. And is that for fear of further prosecution of the volunteers? Yeah. And so I guess that's also something that I really wanted to raise awareness of and discuss a bit today, in terms of beyond just this campaign and beyond just, you know, this context, what we're looking at in terms of a worsening hostile environment. So there's two pieces of legislation which seeks to further criminalise protest and activism, and also the Nationality and Borders Bill, which is making the hostile environment further hostile, and so making those kinds of what they're calling processing centres, but essentially offshore prisons, where people will be kept before they get processed and decided leave to remain, where people will be kept for a further amount of time. And so we really see that, like, this is not just unique to Greece, it's not just unique to Europe, but it's not just unique to Britain, it is really like a global thing, and I think showing that solidarity across those borders. So we've been organising with a group called Solidarity Knows No Borders, and it doesn't, and it shouldn't, because these patterns are happening regardless of the borders, even though they are designed to securitise and force borders further. And so I guess that's kind of what I wanted to relate it to a bit here at St James's, and the work that we do as a community, and, you know, how we fight to make sure that the voices of those we support are heard, and also that we can kind of look towards a more safe and humane and just and compassionate immigration system, and one that doesn't endanger lives for something as arbitrary as when you were born. Because that's what I think, to me, feels very, very arbitrary, and it might be because 3 out of 4 of my grandparents, you know, weren't from England, but where you're born just feels like an incredibly random thing to determine so much, but also for then your life to be worth less, to the extent that it's okay if asylum seekers drown at sea in this journey, because actually they shouldn't be coming here anyway, but it's fine if I'm here. And that, to me, just feels very arbitrary and very random. But I guess that kind of leads us on to how can we help, and what can we do, and how can we address this with the Free Humanitarians Campaign?
Yeah, I mean, so as I said, one of the main things that we've learned is that this will be one with hearts and minds on our side. So literally, people just talking to others about the fact that this is happening is important. People raising awareness is so vital. And I guess also some defiance, insofar as we shouldn't ever doubt that helping someone is a crime. It isn't. We shouldn't let ourselves think it is, and so continuing to help others is important. From a point of view of Free Humanitarians, we've started this very small campaign, and it's growing more and more, and what we're doing here is we're trying to get politicians on board, to have them write to their counterparts in Greece, to raise funds for legal costs, which are astronomical, for people to sign a petition who agree that these charges against us should be dropped. All of these actions are really important to us. on an individual level, but they do also have a dimension in the more broader reaching international context.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've kind of discussed a bit as well is that how you think and the advice is the campaign is going to be won is through the pressure internationally, I guess,
That's right.
Reputation
That's
being
right.
impacted.
That's right. It's terrifying how. So the first thing is that Prime Minister Mitsotakis in Greece, he takes his Twitter account extremely seriously, seemingly more serious than arguably his judicial systems. That was facetious. Now I shouldn't have said that, but the point.
I'm trying to hold my tongue.
What's so frightening, and I guess a sign of the times, is that Twitter is one of the most important human rights tools we have. And tweeting at Mitsotakis, highlighting that he should not be doing these things, which are a complete injustice, is something we can do and something that we believe will make a big difference. So if you have a Twitter account and you want to add your voice to this, that would be important. So it's all about that.
People, I haven't got a mobile phone.
Good for you. Good for you.
Is it great living with that level of peace? Trust me, I don't. But I think there will be some Twitter storms being organised in the next week or so.
Yes, hopefully. Need to do that tomorrow.
Pending on that, just whatever just happened there, whatever like to-do list.
A reminder that has to happen.
I do feel a bit inclined to say, no, you're joking, when I come up with these kind of things, but it's difficult to realise that it's actually serious, isn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And we've also put together a couple of other actions that will say that people can kind of follow along with, and all of the details will be in the description box. I feel like a proper YouTuber now. All of the links will be in the description box if you're watching this at home. But so there is a fundraiser, there is a petition which people can sign, and I can pass this over to you now in a minute. There's also a public letter which looks a little bit, oh, that's a lot of information that people don't need, that looks like this, that will also be linked below. And then on the 18th, so the first day of the trial, there will be an action. The location is to be confirmed, but the Facebook event will be linked below, and it will be in a relevant place. And that will be to try and encourage those decision makers to make the right decision, basically, and drop the charges. And we will hopefully have some speakers, including one of the Standards to 15, who has similar experience being criminalised for solidarity. And hopefully lots of people, so come with your banners, come with everything. It's from 6:30 p.m, so the details will all be below for that. And there's also an online event you've got.
Yeah, so on the 11th, which is this Thursday, exactly a week before trial, the guilty feminist, Deborah Frances White, has agreed to do an interview with Sarah and myself to try and kind of discuss the case one last time a week before trial, so we can get people hopefully interested in participating in these actions and have some quotable material that we can put out into the world that might facilitate more engagement in this campaign as it comes to the last week, that last moment.
And these things on the St James's website?
So unfortunately we can't put them on the website because the website is currently being updated, and it means that all of the information can only come on one time. But
the newsletter maybe?
Yes, I will make sure it's in the newsletter. That is a great shout. Yeah, thank you. And then the other thing is on the link tree, which is here. There is some information. This is not. I've just realised. Yeah, that's not the most up-to-date one. So ignore what was on there all this time before. For event planning, you can download these and write. I stand with and share these around so we can show our solidarity. So if it's okay, we might get a photo with you holding one that we can share, and maybe some others. And yeah, that is a good way that we can also kind of raise a bit of awareness.